And we're live. So I'll assume at this point that if your camera is still on, you're okay knowing that this is going up on YouTube and you're okay being recorded. And again, if you do not want that, you can just scroll down and hit stop video before there. So tonight's call, I've got a really special friend and mentor on with me, and I'm going to introduce him just in a moment. But I'll just give you a little bit of an overview for kind of where we're going tonight and what the game plan is. And just one other logistical thing I wanted to mention. So next week's nature call, we were supposed to have Mark Mori on, and he's not able to make it next week. So we're actually not going to have a call next week. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with my wife, Laura, from Wild Muskoka. So that should be a super fun one there. So yeah, just a quick little note there. And for tonight's call, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen in a moment here, just to kind of bring our minds and our hearts together in a good way and help us make sure that we're staying connected and grounded with the earth while we're sitting in front of this modern piece of technology here, connected. I like to think about it as kind of bringing the outdoors in when we do this opening piece. So I'm going to pass it over to him in a moment. Then we're going to do a little intro session, kind of this nature awareness segment that we do each week. And then the remainder of the call, we're going to have a conversation with Stephen. There'll be an opportunity for some questions and answers. Oh, and last, I just want to introduce Sherry Ann, who some of you know that have been around with us. She's the moderator for the call here. She's kind of helping with some of the tech stuff behind the scenes. So if myself or Stephen reference a book or a link or a resource, and you see Sherry Ann put that in the chat or something pop up in the chat from Sherry Ann, just know that she's going to be kind of sharing some of the resources that we mentioned throughout the night. So thank you so much for your support as always, Sherry Ann. Folks, you can check out Sherry Ann has a really cool podcast. And she has an awesome Instagram account called Blue Jay Botanicals. So she just shared it there. If you want to check her out on Instagram there, or if you want to check out her podcast, she'll share a link for that as well. And with that all said, I'd love it to pass it over to Stephen. I'll introduce Stephen after, but I'd like to kind of formally start our evening and pass it over to Stephen just to bring our minds and our hearts together. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, folks. I'm very appreciative of your time and, inviting me into your house, bringing me into your house, because however strange this may seem, that's what's going on. You're in my bedroom, I'm in your house, and we're strangers, but maybe we won't be so much strangers by the end of this. I guess just off the top, just to thank Chris and just how things kind of circle back around on us in our life. Chris and I had quite an intense period, but it was like 15 years ago or something, and then we barely saw each other. And we've been through lots of the same curves. And if I'm not mistaken, we actually have the same birthday. Not the same year, but the same day, which has got to count for something, Anyways, so I'm thankful to you, Chris, just for inviting me and thinking of me. I'm pretty out of practice at talking because I haven't been doing schools or any kind of workshops or gigs out or much of anything. So it might take me a little while to get rolling, but you had asked me to start with a kind of a prayer or a blessing or meditation. So maybe I'll just step into that now. It's kind of easy for me right now. As I close my eyes, I can hear the peepers very, very clearly through these 10-inch log walls. I can hear their intensity out there and their celebratory energy of this love that's rising from the earth into all the plants. And let's just think about that for a second and the beauty of that, in the whole of the Northern Hemisphere, there's this beautiful rush of love and energy coming out of the earth and into the plants right now. And what an incredible time this is. Like, it's just the absolute most peak time, filled with love and filled with that very beginnings of love, which of course in a way is the sweetest. It's the most attractive. And right now outside, as soon as I step outside, the plum blossoms, the wild plums are all in the hedgerows around the farm here. And I've hosted them, and someone hosted them for a good 100 years before I got here. And they're sweet and absolutely innocent. You know, the eastern doorway, we're facing that beautiful time of year, the very beginning, the dawn of the season. And to just sit in that wonder, that beautiful green wonder that's coming towards us, and it's going to feed us, and we're breathing it, and we would not be here without it. And just to have a moment of real gratitude for that green spirit, you know, that's rising up into everything now. Yeah, thank you so much. And I gotta say, you know, it saves my life every year. Every year, right about this time, I look around and I'm like, oh, I really want to be here. It's not an endurance test, which the last, 6 months sometimes in the north feels like not all filled with joy, the same kind of joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I can so relate to that. So, yeah, I'll maybe just do a little bit of an introduction to Stephen in my relationship with him, just for those that don't know it or haven't maybe come across his work or had the pleasure of spending some time with him. But yeah, as Stephen mentioned, we spent some time together, going back maybe 15 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. And my wife and I at the time went and spent some time hanging out on the land that he's been tending for quite some time. And it was a really, really potent experience for me, like nothing short of life-changing. And I feel like I've almost had this really interesting, magical relationship with Stephen since then, and that like he kind of alluded to, we don't actually see each other that often or speak that often, but there just seems to be some interesting parallels in our path, and sharing the same birthday date, it was one of those there. But he lives on this beautiful, beautiful piece of earth over in what we call the Ottawa Valley. Sometimes it's referred to. Golden Lake is the name of the town around there. And he's got, there's large areas of land that he tends in a very interesting way. And for myself, having been brought up in this kind of modern farming permaculture, I was there at a pretty influential and pivotal time in my life, and I had a lot of excitement and energy, and I was really new to learning a lot of things about nature. Fresh out of college with my kind of Western scientific mind that wanted to study nature and learn skills in this really kind of tactical way, and was kind of approaching gardening the same way as well. From very much from like book knowledge and possibilities. And then to come onto this piece of land with Stephen, who just moved so slowly, and just seemed to have this real awareness it role modeled something different to me, a different way of relating to the land that I hadn't been exposed to too much. Maybe theoretically, but not in person, in a body-based way. So I just want to share that, spending that time and just watching how he related and how he moved with the land really influenced me in a deep way. And there's something about his energy and his presence that feels like a reset for me every time I come back into connection with him. And I want to thank you so much for that, Stephen. For how little we communicate in the, with our voices. You really have influenced me in huge ways, and I continue to learn from you. So I want to thank you for that. And I have a story I'm going to use for actually our nature awareness piece. That actually builds on that a little bit. But I guess what I'll end it with is, Stephen runs an amazing, I guess, school you'd call it, called Sacred Gardener School. And they run courses and they make all kinds of beautiful medicines and foods from the land over on their homestead. And have just a really beautiful approach to tending the land and thinking about the need of the land and all of the creatures they share that land with, as a top kind of guiding focus in the way that they interact. And it's really inspiring. It's really different even than what I've seen in, the permaculture world that I'm very involved in. So he's an author, he's a poet, he's a philosopher, he's a teacher, a herbalist, a very just interesting and great person. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Stephen. I know sometimes it's weird to talk after someone's just said a whole bunch of stuff about you, but if you want to share anything else about yourself, feel free to, or if not, I can kind of open up our first segment of the night.
No, that's lovely. Thank you. You go ahead.
Awesome. So as I said at the beginning, for those of you that are new with us, we kind of break these calls into the 3 parts. We do the opening, and then we do this kind of nature awareness segment. And really, it's kind of a fun check-in on just what's happening out in nature in our own backyards and on the piece of land that we're living on in our habitat. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what's going on where I live, and then I'm going to pass it over to Stephen, and then we're going to have an opportunity for you folks to jump into breakout rooms and be able to share with people potentially all over North America and sometimes all over the world. And the feedback's been that it's really fun to kind of get that check-in of what's going on all across this beautiful planet that we live in. And it's kind of neat to be able to track what's happening in different ecosystems and with the seasons. So I'll start off with my piece, and I'm actually going to do it a little bit differently tonight. Usually I just kind of start naming off observations, but I'd like to share a little bit of a story to kick it off. And it actually goes back to last night. So I've actually spent way too much time on the computer this week, to the point that I'm really like feeling it in my head and feeling it in my body. And I don't think I'd actually even realized how I was feeling it. And then all of a sudden yesterday, I was supposed to have a check-in with Stephen in the evening. We were going to do a little tech chat. And sure enough, as soon as it kind of came into my consciousness that I was going to be connecting with Stephen that evening, I at the same time, it came into my consciousness how much I was feeling this and just like being in computer world and actually not feeling my kind of awareness and in this interesting place. So I was feeling all of that yesterday as we prepared for the call. And literally, Stephen and I are supposed to jump on a call at 8 o'clock. And I send him the link, and it's 7:59. And at 8 o'clock, the power goes out. And Stephen kind of had mentioned, there's this interesting kind of story and kind of magic that, for lack of a better word, I feel like there's a little bit of magic in our relationship. So the power goes out at 8 o'clock, just as I'm supposed to jump on there. And for whatever reason, when the power went out, like it was this huge like sigh of relief, like a weight coming off my shoulder. And I felt my body relax and I could breathe. And even though I was supposed to be getting on this call, I was like, oh, this is great. I'm just going to turn on my phone and I'm going to hotspot my computer and I'll walk outside and talk to Stephen. And the connection was choppy, so we didn't talk very long. But I had this very short connection with him yesterday evening. And then I went for this long walk into the forest as the sun was going down and hung out till quite a ways after dark last night and had this magical moment. And this is where it's kind of coming into what's going on in nature in your backyard. I'm walking down this beautiful path and the spring peepers are super, super loud. I don't know if any of you folks know the woodcock, but they do this beautiful little beep, beep sound, and then they'll take off in the air and you can hear them in flight. And it's like, I'm not doing that call well, but you hear this flight noise. You can hear them fly the whole way and they'll do this big circle and then they'll circle around and land almost in the same spot again. And then they'll go me, 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 and they'll sit there for a bit and then they'll go off and do it again. So I'm sitting there listening to the woodcock, and right at dawn, there's this bird that starts calling. And I want to play this call and see if anybody recognizes the call of this. Can you, maybe Stephen or Sherry Ann, just give me a thumbs up if you can actually hear this sound when it starts playing. Let's see.
Yeah, I can hear.
So I'm curious, maybe if folks don't even want to throw it in the chat, does anyone know the bird that I just played there? Did anyone hear that one? So I remember the first time I ever consciously noticed that bird was actually on your land, Stephen, there. And I remember walking down that road back to this area where you were cutting poplars to build, I think, a cob building at the time, or what do you call it? Like a stacked wood building. And I remember sitting in the forest and being like, what is this? They sounded like, the way I think about it, and I don't think the song I just played there quite gives them justice, but I remember thinking about it, it's like fairies that are playing harps from the trees. Like it's so melodic and beautiful. and they were just singing all around me. So last night, you know, after like a pretty stressful week and really feeling just caught up in my head and the computer, and after having this funny little moment with Steven, I walked out and I'm sitting listening to them. And that's the first time I've heard them singing this year. And instantly it brought me back to hanging out with Steven 15 years ago and hearing them for the first time and just being like, what is this magical place I'm in right now? So that was just a really beautiful, beautiful connection moment that happened for me last night. And I guess what I'll share is, you know, we've noticed a few last week. I remember mentioning to you folks that things had gone really quiet with the birds the last little bit. We kind of had this big wave of birds that came in, and then not too many new birds had returned. And just in the last couple of days, several thrushes have come back. And several sparrows have come back. The chipping sparrows come back. The white-throated sparrows come back. So just having a few of those other birds in the landscape has just really kind of lifted my spirits up. And last night, that was just really special. A couple other things that are on my mind right now. The black flies are just starting to wake up. I'm seeing them fly around. They're not biting yet, which is very early here. You know, like potentially 3 weeks earlier than I saw the first black fly last year, at least 2 weeks anyways. So very early, black flies coming. Lots of flowers starting to open up out on the wild landscape. I was just noticing the leatherwood is flowering over here. And in the wetlands, the leather leaf, two beautiful plants are starting to flower. And in the garden, our asparagus is just starting to shoot up. And interestingly enough, it always coincides with the first flush of our mushrooms from our shiitake mushroom logs. So we've got these little tiny shiitake mushrooms coming off the logs and just the first little heads of the asparagus coming out of the ground. So it's such an exciting time of the year right now. So that's kind of a few things of what's going on over in my neighborhood, and a little bit of a story just on the magic of this time of the year and the magic of last night that I wanted to share with you folks. Stephen, what is kind of on your awareness and what's happening over in Golden Lake right now? And the other question I'll just ask, is there another name that you use for that region other than Golden Lake or the Ottawa Valley?
Not really Upper Ottawa Valley, I guess,
Okay.
to be a little bit more specific. You know, and there's 7 different watersheds that are flowing off the Algonquin Dome, you know, and so the Bonashir and the Madawaska watershed is really how First Nations people would have identified where we are right now. Because, you know, that was the way that they politically understood things. It was, and how things were delineated. It was all watersheds. And so there's actually 7 different tribal people, you know, in this area, and 2 in this specific area. For me now, oh man, the plums are just incredible. You know, I mentioned it in the little introduction there, but it's a really beautiful thing. And I guess it's interesting you said that thing about the birds a few weeks ago, because my faith in nature's deep wisdom of what's going on has grown in the last couple weeks, because basically we've been having spring here for like a month. But the trees, these birds, all these different beings had the wherewithal to feel that it was not time yet. Mosquitoes, black flies, all of these ones, right? And then just as we come over the full moon, just over the hump of that into a new kind of section of time, and the weather changes, then everything's starting to flow in now. And that kind of, again, that spring energy, that, you know, if you can think of the smell of cherry trees, it's pretty much like the wild plums. It's this kind of, I don't know how to describe it except for this, there's this incredible innocence, you know, even compared to apples. Oh, they're heartless compared to the cherries and the plums, you know. So like literally you're engulfed in it as soon as you step outside. It's like this beautiful, beautiful, subtle perfume. I'm by this big wetland, so I hear the woodcocks. Really do. They kind of they fly around like that in circles, and I hear the boom, 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 boom. So for those of you who might not know that one, it's an easy guess if you know it. It's very distinct. Yeah, yeah. And there's that. They do the waving in the grass thing. The same bird. So those are kind of, and same thing. The black flies and a few mosquitoes just started today. So I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. So we're going to give everyone an opportunity to jump in a room if you'd like to. This is obviously completely optional. We're probably going to go about 12-ish minutes in there. I've been trying to find out the kind of play with the perfect time for this. And basically, it's just an opportunity to kind of share what you're exciting about, to have your stories from being out on the land captured. So what's going on around you outside these days? You know, what's happening out in nature? What are you excited about? Maybe you've got a mystery question that's burning in your mind. You know, you saw a track or you heard a sound, or you just have some question about the synchronicity of how it all comes together. So this could also be a great opportunity to share that. And as we go into these rooms, I just want to, share that you're welcome to be here regardless of where you're at in your journey. If you have a lot to share, great. If you want to go in and just be a fly on the wall, you're welcome to just kind of come in and be quiet and listen as well. And I will also just ask that if you're in there, just be aware of all voices that are in there. We've got a limited amount of time, and I know we can get excited, and sometimes we'll just start talking, and suddenly, you've talked for over half of the time, and there's 5 other people that need to speak. So maybe just to hold some awareness to the other people in the room and hearing all voices. And if you've said a lot and a couple other people have and someone hasn't, maybe just let there be a little bit of quiet and a little bit of space for a moment, because maybe somebody's just trying to get up the courage to share something or trying to process their thought. And just know that you're welcome, to be there regardless of where you're at. If you feel like, oh my goodness, I don't know anything about birds and all of these topics, that's okay. Just come in and have fun and enjoy and learn. So I'll just share that. On a logistical note, the first couple of minutes, once we jump into the rooms, I'll be jumping around and playing with making sure that there's an even number of people in each room. Or close to it. So if you end up in a room and there's only a couple of people, you might end up getting shifted. Or if you're in there by yourself, just hang tight and I'll get that all sorted out within a couple of minutes. So we're going to jump into those right now. Watch for an invite that's going to come up on your screen, and we'll jump in for approximately 12 minutes, and then I'll call everybody back, and then we'll kind of shift into the next part of our call. So just give me a half second here. Need to find Stephen. Hey, Stephen, are you back? All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that little experience there. I went out and just stood outside and took in the peepers for a couple of minutes there, and it was it was really nice. Really appreciating that medicine right now. So awesome. So Stephen, let's have a little chat. There's so many different topics I feel like we could dive into tonight, and things I would love to get into. But maybe one thing that would be interesting to start with is just this idea of wild culturing. I think you call it, and when I'm not talking about fermenting vegetables, I'm more although maybe that's a part of wild culturing, but I'm more thinking about the way that you kind of tend this land and your gardens in a much, it's not everything's in neat rows where it's just like monocultures of crops growing beside each other. And it's just a very different approach to tending the land there and growing your food and working with the land. So I'd love it if you wanted to maybe expand a little bit on what that kind of means, and maybe even how you came about to that kind of way of relating with the earth and the food that you grow.
All right. How much time do we have?
We got about half an hour.
Okay, that's quick for me, but it might take me a half an hour to get rolling. Okay, so wild culturing. Well, this kind of came about. I learned how to forage before I learned how to garden, by a good 10 years, pretty much. And then I lived with somebody, and she was like an old school gardener, and she taught me how to organic garden, basically. They didn't call it that, but it was organic gardening. And I kind of despised it. I despised what I call the Germanic tendencies, where everything's in order and everything's under your control. And basically, it's kind of like a form of fascism, the way most people garden. And so I was really struggling with this because I was involved in growing my own foods. So if there's one thing, if you know farmers in particular, they do not change the way they do things because they're growing food or they're growing their subsistence economy. They're making their money somehow through their farming, and man, they don't change stuff. So I was kind of like, it was just at the beginnings of permaculture. This was about 30 years ago. So I wasn't aware of that at that time. So for me, there was no kind of maps. And then I happened to go down to Mexico that winter and spent time in Chiapas and watched the way the people gardened there. And what they would do is they'd create a clearing, which is like they're milpas. They're known as milpas, and it's pretty much that horrific thing that we all think of. They cut the forest down and they burn it, and we're like, oh, that's the worst thing you can do. But of course, if you want to grow food, you need sunlight, and so people have been doing this thing of cutting small clearings for 400,000 years. Like it's one of those things that we've created to bring in the wild culture that feeds on the herbaceous layer. And then the Mayans adopted it. And so they would do a clearing and they'd plant like over 100 different species in one go. And so some of those species are long-term perennials, some of them are annuals, and everything in between. And at a certain point, they'd kind of let the garden go back to the wild, right? Like maybe after about 5 to 10 years of more intensive crops like corn and beans, they'd let it go back to just the wild plants and it would So this was all just like to me. So I ended up doing kind of an MA through Trent on this topic of Indigenous agriculture and specifically this idea of intensive successional growing. So I'd have to say that it certainly wasn't my idea, and this is probably true across the board, that these things are never our ideas. Like all the ideas in permaculture, all the ideas in biodynamic agriculture, they were all taken from Indigenous people, pretty much, whether they were acknowledged as such or not. That's where they got the ideas from. And so I would, acquiesce that I'm one of those people, but right up front, I always wanted to say that this is where I got this idea from. It wasn't my idea, right? Because I was struggling though with the idea, because I was a forager, I was struggling with the idea of gardening. And then when I saw what they were doing, and of course, like volunteer plants and the biodiversity in those gardens brings in so much wildlife. And then the wildlife takes care of the bugs and is planting other things. And, it's all like part of the ecology, the gardening. And then this was for me just like, well, this is what we have to do. Quite clearly, this is what we have to do because we're taking all the land. So if we can somehow invite the wild into our gardens, if we can host it, this is the solution for agriculture for me. And so I did write a book on it, the Madawaska Forest Garden, describing the process of making this forest garden, which basically emulated an Indigenous garden, although I had a much wider range of plants to choose from, and it wasn't traditional. So in those two ways, it wasn't at all Indigenous. But in the sense that I was working with the earth energy, I was trying to figure out what she would receive from me. And so every plant that I introduced, I did meditations on, and I still do. I never introduce something without first psychically introducing it. It's like if you have friends and you think, oh, they'd probably like this guy over here. Tell them about him first, right? You don't just pop by with the person out of the blue. I don't anyways. I don't appreciate it either. I like a little heads up, and so do the plants, so do all the animals. Give us a heads up. And if you're attuned to things, you can hear their response. in the silence after your question. And you might have to wait, you might have to do it a bunch of times, but they will respond. And when I say they, I mean the whole reflection of reality. So it might even just be the clouds coming over the sun, or the sun making a big rainbow around it, or again, the sound of a bird, or the way the wind is flowing through a tree. If you're attuned to these things, you can feel how they're tied into our thoughts. Reality is reflecting us back to ourselves all the time. And if you're not aware of that, then you haven't even begun the journey yet of how this stuff works and of working with it. So that's kind of the grand sweep of wild culturing and what it's about. And really, I think it kind of, I'm not really into, whatever. I'm not into politics or political correctness. I always cross lines. I have no idea what people are thinking these days. But one of the things I think about is that, what was his name? Schumacher. He said, the way we treat the earth is the way we treat our culture. It's the exact same. Agriculture is an extension of culture. Culture is an extension of agriculture. So if we act like fascists and we need to control everything in our gardens, what's that say about us? And, if I'd said this 3 years ago or something, the idea of controlling people and stuff like that, it might not have gone over quite so well. But as I'm saying it now, I'm like, oh, this is going to roll, man, because it seems quite clear to everybody the control games, the things that are going on now are frightening, absolutely frightening. So again, they're an indicator of our agricultural practice. They're an extension of the same type of thinking. And indeed, all those pharmaceuticals and all those, pesticides and, all those things are coming from the same companies, and Bayer being at the very peak of it all. So I don't support any of that, none of that, right? I never have. I've never gone there even. And I think, I'm ranting now. Okay, maybe I'll stop.
But I resonate with that rant a lot there, Stephen. Yeah, that was a beautiful, what you said there. If we can invite the wilds into our gardens and host it. I love that thought. And I'm imagining, this idea of wild culturing and interacting with the forest and the garden veggies we want to grow is really new to some folks here. And, some folks here, I'd imagine quite a few folks are actually maybe living in urban spaces where they've got an urban backyard and maybe they've got a little small, 10 by 10 plot or something. Maybe, do you have a thought on that? If somebody's like really new to this idea of really working with the earth in this more symbiotic way, and let's say maybe they still want to, because I know you do grow some traditional vegetables, or at least when I was there, you grew beets and carrots. Yeah. And so maybe you could give an example of one, what does it look like to actually integrate some of these for lack of better words, these modern foods that we don't really even know where they came from, but that we all live off of, in with that in a healthy way.
Yep.
And then for folks that are like completely new to this, what would be like that very first kind of Eastern step in even exploring this idea and this philosophy? Because it's pretty big what you just kind of spoke to, and for folks where that feels like a long ways away, what does it look like to just even begin to explore that?
Yeah, I think the very beginning of it is knowing every plant that comes up in your garden. So this was the thing is like, again, when I learned how to garden from this woman, Angela, and her family, was all into this and stuff. And you would go down and you just hoe out all the weeds. And we used kind of fresh manure the first year on the garden. So it was just terrible. The amount of weeding was just like, for me coming out of the bush, I was just like, why would anyone ever do this? It just seemed like so much work to me. And And then at some point down the line, I can't remember, a few years into gardening, I think some of my local kind of hippie friends up here started to kind of point some of the plants out to me. These were back to the landers from back in the day in the 60s who had been up here for a long time, and they knew that you could eat lamb's quarters, and they knew that you could eat green amaranth, and they knew that you could eat purslane, and they knew that you could eat these plants. I didn't know. And so here I'd been pulling something out of my garden, which is lamb's quarters, which just about everybody has in their gardens. And it's more nutritious than anything you're going to grow, except for maybe kale or something. But it's incredibly nutritious. People will struggle and bend over backwards to try to grow something like spinach. And then you have this weed growing in your garden that basically is spinach. You can use it for all the same things in the same ways and everything. So like, just to kind of extrapolate on that as far as it goes, we actually harvest and blanch and freeze 10 kilograms of lamb's quarters and other things, smartweed and amaranth, green amaranth, and a bunch of other plants that all come up in the garden. And it's just, as I weed, I go through, I harvest everything out first that's nice, and then everything else goes into the compost pile. And the compost pile isn't a compost pile. It's an altar to death and decay. It's an altar to the gods of death and decay. So then when you're pulling a plant from your garden, it's not a destructive act, it's a creative act, because then you're offering it to these deities that replenish the vitality of your garden. So that'd be the very tip of the iceberg for any kind of new gardeners, is like, know the plants you're pulling. Don't pull anything unless you can identify it. And what people have now, and I can't believe I'm even promoting this, that we didn't have 30 years ago, is there's these frickin' apps, man. My wife will tell you what it is. I'm sure Chris knows what it is. Kind of put me out of a job. Like suddenly you can just point it at any plant and it'll tell you what it is. So you got no excuses now. Like I had kind of an excuse for a few years because nobody told me, but now everything that comes up in your garden, honor it, pay attention to it. It's a volunteer. It's bringing its energy from the underground, from the underworld up into the light, into your world, you know, and it's an offering. And if it's not directly for you, then it's for the earth. You know, if it's something like a bindweed or something that most people wouldn't know how to use, you got to understand that that plant is healing the earth. These weeds, all these weeds come as healers. They come after colonization, after the plowing, after all the destruction. They come in like this beautiful parade of healers, is what I call them, you know, parade of kings and queens that come into our garden. And here we are hating their guts and like resenting them and stuff. It's just an incredibly backward approach that most people have.
It's such a beautiful way to look at it. You know, we had a really cool chat. For those of you that have been following along, back in, it was the first call in the spring series. We had this lady on, Sunshine Rose from out on Standing Rock. She was a Lakota lady, and we were chatting about restoration on the land there and kind of early steps. And one of the pieces that she kind of shared with the group, you know, how to get started. I think I asked her something to the nature of, you know, how do you get started in thinking about land restoration? And she had said, you know, observe the plants that come in after disturbance and observe their characteristics and sit with them and get to know them. And we were having a chat about mullein, you know, and for those of you that don't know mullein, it has these beautiful green fuzzy plants that grow kind of in this world off the ground, and they get quite large. And, you know, I just imagine like, you know, them being a pillow and sleeping on them. They're so beautiful. And then in the second year, they grow these big, tall, long stalks reaching up to the sky and have these beautiful, gorgeous yellow flowers. I'm sure you've seen them along the side of the road if you haven't, if you're not familiar with it, you know, just driving down the highway or whatever. But if I think about that plant, you know, it grows, you know, in like super compressed, like even like you'll go to like an old gravel pit and it's totally barren, but there'll be mullein plants all over. And when I think about like observing that plant, they grow these big leaves 2 years in a row and they lay them all down on the earth. And now you have this bare earth, but now there's vegetation on top of it. And on top of that, they send these deep, strong roots down into the ground, and they break up that compressed soil. And then after 2 years, they die. They're not a perennial, but now they've loosened up the soil a little bit. They've created chambers for bacteria and air. And so it's just kind of neat. I'm just kind of reflecting on that and thinking about all these plants that come into our garden. It could be really a really beautiful journey to go on, to really just think about the qualities of these plants and why are they growing there to begin with is kind of what I'm reflecting on, and you sharing that, Stephen. Hey, somebody asked a question here. I don't know exactly what they were looking for, but they just said, any words on bindweed? Does anything come up for you when you hear the question, any words on bindweed?
For me?
Yeah, there's a question.
I guess you're interviewing me, eh? Oh, okay. Maybe I should speak to it. So there's this book called Medicinal Invasive Plants, something like that. If you Google it, it'll come up. He was a student of Stephen Booner's herbalist, and he started to realize that Japanese knotweed would come into an area at the same time as Lyme disease, and that it's the treatment for it. So again, Japanese knotweed is a perfect example of a plant that people hate. I actually have never had more responses than my article on Japanese knotweed. Got more responses than anything I've ever written, and it's because people hated it so much. Anyways, it's just like this incredible healing plant, and it truly is the embodiment of the goddess. Like, you don't fuck with her, man. When Japanese knotweed starts to come in, you just back off, right? She's trying to tell you something, right? And what she's trying to tell you is you shouldn't have cut down the forest, right? Is part of what she's doing, because as soon as the forest comes in, she's gone. She just leaves, right? Meanwhile, you cannot get rid of that plant with dynamite, with backhoes, with anything. I've seen that plant move under a parking lot, like 40 meters across a road with 2 sidewalks on both sides, another 20 meters or so, and then pop out in the cracks beside a building. So it can move like 80 meters underground. Right? There's only females of Japanese knotweed. There's no males here. So it's all coming from the rhizomes. Anyways, just an example. So bindweed, I wish I had it off the top of my head. I'm not a kind of an encyclopedic person. I really only remember the things that I work with and am connected to deeply. But I have read about bindweed, and there is uses for it. In my experience, and what I would say right off the top of my head is that it's extremely deep taproot, extremely deep. You'll never get to the bottom of it. So like Chris said about the mullein, the bindweed is pulling those minerals, those inorganic, undigestible, in a sense, minerals up to the surface. And then it's, it goes all over the place. And then it's layering that stuff and turning it into organic components the plants can eat and stuff. So for me, I completely tolerate it, but I just keep harvesting it back and putting it in, again, my altars of decay. The compost is, and again, you want to be very careful that you don't be transferring the root of that plant into your compost, because then you might end up transferring it into another garden, which is part of the reason I do all my composting. Like I have 7 gardens or something. I do all my composting in each garden. I don't transfer it to a central compost area or something like that, because I have different weeds in each garden, and I like it the way it is, and it likes it the way it is, and I don't want to mess that up. So I don't want everything growing in that one garden, or it'll just be too messy. So that's a plant I know nothing about.
Cool. Oh man, I don't know which thread I want to jump on right now. I've got kind of 3 kind of going on my head here. One thing I'll maybe just share on the Japanese knotweed one, and I'm wondering if you would share similar observations. But down south, and I think about when I've been down in Toronto and Southern Ontario, there's a lot of like, invasive species and watch out for knotweed and it's taking over and it's so invasive. And what I found, I've been to places down in Toronto, where it's everywhere. And it's really strong. But when I think about that habitat, it's a very disturbed, out of sync habitat. And I've actually seen some spots where, and interesting enough, knotweed is relatively new up where I live in Muskoka. It's kind of come in the last 10, 12 years, from my understanding. And sure enough, it came in about the same time that we started noticing a few more ticks in this area. So that is a really interesting relationship, just the magic of those relationships like you spoke to. But the other thing that I've really observed here, I haven't seen knotweed be this real invasive problem in Muskoka. And I don't even want to use the word problem because I'm not saying that that even is a problem down south, but in the way that it's referred to as a problem down south, I haven't seen it be that way up here. I know quite a few farms where it'll grow in this one little corner of the farm, but it doesn't encroach into the forest and it just kind of stays there. And I've even seen some of these patches grow smaller over time. And it seems like what you said there, if the integrity of the forest is intact, then, it's not as, I don't even know what the word I'm trying to say there. But do you observe something similar there, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I actually lost a patch, so I use it medicinally in many different capacities. But there was a kind of a really nice patch I'd had. It probably came from somebody dumping their garden debris down some side road, because how else would it have got there? And it was quite strong. And this is not a plant that you have to worry about over harvesting. Like, no. And I'm somebody who would know. And I actually did almost kind of cause it to kind of fade out of this one spot. And I had to stop harvesting it there and went someplace else. But it was a forested area and it's got nowhere to go. It's got no purpose. I've seen it grow as far north, like North Bay and beyond. I did a workshop up on a reserve in it sounds like Quebec or something. I can't remember. Northern Ontario. And right at the base of a waterfall where the land was being eaten away, there was this patch of Japanese knotweed that somebody had obviously planted there who knew what that plant was. And it worked perfectly as a shore retainer. It does not let one little grain of sand out of its clutches. And when you try washing the roots, you figure this out pretty quick, that that's actually why it's called knotweed, is because its roots are like all knotted up and around the dirt and rocks and stuff. Like, it holds everything in place, so I would say that it has its place. And if it's put in a barren spot, then it's like, okay, baby, let's fix this. And it starts expanding out. If it's in a bit more of a healthy area, then it seems to have, some respect. The other kind of joke that I always say about Japanese knotweed is maybe they should bring the male over and then the female won't be searching for the male all the time, because apparently in Japan, it's not at all aggressive. So I don't know. I'm sure that wouldn't be a popular idea, but that's what occurs to me.
I love the thought process there. Sherry Ann just posted the book there. It's called Invasive Plant Medicine and Ecological Abilities. Yeah, the name of the book I think you're referring to there. Thanks, Sherry Ann, for tossing that out there. Hey, Stephen, I don't know how you feel about discussing this topic, because I didn't really prep you on it. So feel free to decline, because I know it's a heavy one. But would you be into chatting about Lyme a little bit? You feel up to that, or tonight?
Oh yeah, sure.
Sure. Because I know last week, I'll just share a little piece there.
Like, sure.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say last week, I don't know if it was last week, it might have been 2 weeks ago, it kind of had come up, and we talked a little bit about it, and I'd mentioned that it's been a part of my journey on this planet, Lyme, and it's something that I have a relationship with, and I know you share a relationship with it as well. That's all I was going to say. I didn't mean to cut you off there. So, but yeah, what about maybe just relationship? I guess maybe the way I'd like to approach this is I know a lot of people that are hitting this place of almost having a fear of the woods because of Lyme. And for myself, I've really had to work on overcoming that fear and actually recognizing it as like the knotweed is a part of the ecosystem here that has a role and a place, ticks. And really, you know, I've had to reform that relationship because that fear wasn't healthy for me. And I actually believe it makes me more liable to have negative symptoms and impacts from having had Lyme. And since I've kind of made peace with Lyme on the land and ticks on the land, I've actually been a lot healthier because of it, and don't feel it's a barrier to being out in the woods and close. So maybe you could speak a little to that if that feels good to you.
Yeah, you know, it's there's a strong resemblance about what's going on right now with Lyme, right? And before Lyme, it was maybe AIDS or Ebola or something like that. There's these things that are, it's where the shadow of things where we have pushed against nature blindly comes back and falls on us. And then we start to project all our fears and everything into these things, right? So, and then Lyme itself, actually, if you have neuroborealis, it does play with your fear. Because of course, a lot of diseases have intelligence, of course, and on some level, they know that if you're in a fearful state, that's perfect for them, right? So this is a good thing to keep in mind what's going on now. Because I can tell you, compared to Lyme, COVID's a fucking walk in the park, right? But you can deal with them both herbally, no problem. All that information is being suppressed in both cases, right? But the thing with the Lyme is you can't treat it any other way. Once it's systemic, once you've had it for more than a month, it has to be treated herbally, or it's this intravenous antibiotic nightmare that goes on for years, and it's not something that you want to happen. So I've been treating Lyme basically since I got better, which took a couple years. And I kind of felt like it was my obligation to offer that, because when I had it, it was such a dark time. And nobody, you know, I bow down to Stephen Booner, and I've talked to him and his partner, and I'm infinitely thankful to them, because they're pretty much the only people who put out a non-proprietary herbal regime. So everybody else's Lyme regimes are proprietary, which is that you're buying into their thing and you're giving money to them. And so how can you trust that? This is the problem. So, you know, I really bow down to him, and I'm so thankful. And when I started to do workshops kind of based on his work, I called him and said, you know, like, everyone's so worried about Indigenous appropriation, but I feel fucked just appropriating all your information, just as I would any Indigenous person or anything. It's all the same to me. So I made sure I contacted him and we talked, and he was overjoyed. He was like, you are exactly what I want to happen, right? Like, you took my work, you ingested it, you brought it out in a different way. You know, you might have changed a few things, but that's fine, right? You add in things, but you know, the basic protocol that he had, I think, has a lot of material in it that's super, super valuable still to this day, even with all the research. I'm going to tell you just a little story. I know we probably don't have tons of time, but when I first got it, I went to a mentor kind of friend of mine, and I was kind of like shaking my head, like, what's the deal, man? I've spent my whole life bowing down to the earth and defending her and working towards her, and she is my number one. You know, like, what? Why me? Right? I didn't think like that would ever happen to me. I've interacted with every poisonous viper in Central America, and alligators and pumas and bobcats up here and bears. And like, I've had, you name it, spiders, everything. I've had contact with everything, and everything's been cool because I trust them. And then that thing reflects back to me, and nothing ever happens. But then this thing happened with the Lyme. And so I was just like, what's going on with this? Now, it's a deeper question because there was deeply personal stuff. There was some more present cultural stuff. But the question that, I mean, the story that he told me that I really appreciated was, try to make it brief. When he was in college, he was out with a bunch of people. They were all drinking. He didn't even drink. They were heading out from one party to another. They were at the front. He was at the front of the line. And there was people at the back of the line. And the people at the back of the line were being really destructive. And they wrecked some picket fences. And they kind of did some destruction as they walked through some neighborhood. Some guy backed out in his car, up to the front of the line, and punched my friend in the face. He never did anything. He was just at the front of the line. So that's why you got it, Chris, and that's why I got it, is because we're at the front of the line. It's not so much a personal thing, but, you know, this medicine that the earth and this message that the earth is sending to us is sent to people at the front of the line and people who need it. I mean, this is the thing, is that Lyme makes you get your life together. Makes you get your shit together. You can't be fucked up and have Lyme and get better. It just won't happen. You have to have your emotional life together. You have to have your spiritual life together. You have to have your physical life together. And then you get healthy again and the Lyme backs off. And of course, those of us who have had Lyme for years will always have it. It's like malaria. It's there in the background. And, you know, I basically thank Lyme because I probably live longer because of it. You know, I'm more careful, and I don't transgress on things because, again, these shadows can fall on us in unpredictable ways, and it happens all the time to people. And insurance is not going to save you. Insurance never prevented one tragedy. Right? So I'll keep that in mind. I kind of have a little rant about insurance too, but I'll hold it back.
Folks, Sherry Ann just threw a link to Stephen's article there in the chat on Japanese knotweed, the article he referenced. So if anyone's interested in checking out, you can grab that link she just put in there. I'll just share a couple of thoughts on that too, Stephen, because you know, it's really interesting because when I got Lyme, it was back in, I think, 2007, and I got it down in New Jersey. And I was very much in a really not in a good place mentally when I got it, you know, and in some ways I was marching through the world with this like warrior spirit, but also really kind of lost inside and had a lot of bitterness and a lot of anger and frustration. And I was wanting to kind of, you know, be a protector of the earth, but doing it with so much angst and anger and fear and not from a good place. So I've reflected on that a lot in why me and Lyme, you know. And interesting enough, a number of years ago, I don't know whether it was a relapse or I actually reached out to you, but I went through a pretty rough period where it was just like, I got floored again by it. And I started off fighting it with like everything I had, and was just like, same, this warrior spirit, like, I'm not going to let this beat me and blah, blah, blah. And just the more I fought it, the worse I got and the sicker I got. And I was fortunate to connect with a friend of mine who's a very interesting, he's a medical doctor, but he's not your normal medical doctor. I'll just leave it there. He's a very special human being and has a very holistic approach. And he said to me, he said, Chris, I want you to stop trying to figure out what's wrong with you. I want you to stop treating yourself. I want you to stop fighting Lyme. He's like, I want you to actually just recognize that your body's an ecosystem and surrender to that and let it heal. And I want you to stop eating. I want you to stop taking everything. And I just want you to fast for this week. And stop trying to figure out what's going on. And oh my goodness, like I'm getting shivers saying this, but it was like, that was the medicine I needed. And when I really surrendered, and I basically, it was like this week-long meditation around how my body was a living ecosystem that was just a part of this greater ecosystem. And sure enough, after like a month of just being a mess, like a week of not eating any food, and not trying to fight it and not treating. And that was when things started coming back together. And I can just relate in saying that, I can't afford to not have my shit together now. It's this ultimate kind of accountability to living vision and staying on track. And the earth lets me know when I fall off course. And I was kind of referencing, I feel like, it was just a little bit, but I feel like the last couple of days I was actually feeling myself sink into that. And last night was this little checkpoint. And I know to listen to those now, where in the past I maybe wouldn't have, I would have kept kind of pounding through as the warrior until it just slams me and puts me down. So there's been huge medicine for me in my journey. And I'll just relate to that a little bit in my own story there. One other thought that came to mind too, this is just another, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, but I was thinking you talked about, going down to the Chiapas and how they would clear these big pieces of land and then, let the food come through and then let it go back to the earth. But in some ways, there's this cleansing that happens there and the cycling of nutrients and this balance. And one thing I've just thought about with land again is the Indigenous practice of fire tending and lighting fires on the landscape. And it's something I've just thought a lot about, is that's a practice that, from the more I understand, chatting with a few of my Anishinaabe friends, was a rich and ancient part of their heritage. Actually burning the land for food and to actually bring the deer in for their hunting. And that's been a practice we've what is it? Smokey the Bear has taught us to fight fires and that fires are bad, and we've suppressed them. So I've also wondered about the relationship between the lack of fire on the land and the tick populations. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's just, a thought that's been in my mind a little bit lately. Because I don't think Lyme is actually a new thing from my understanding, or ticks are. And it's interesting that they've potentially been here for a really long time, but it's actually a very short period of time that they've become so, they've spread and grown in such large numbers. So I've thought a little bit about just what human activities and our approach to the land has actually created this and allowed something actually natural and part of this landscape to capture our attention in the way that it is now.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought. It's worth meditating on that. And I think just about the forest ecology in this area, we're basically supposed to have a fire about every 25 years. It's supposed to roll through the forests, right? If on average, if there was no fire suppression. And so of course that would wipe out tons of insects, that kind of overwinter or that live on the ground. But it also balances the acidity of the soil and the acidity of the culture, of the plant culture, right? Like, we are phosphate and potassium deficient in the north in these acidic soil areas. So it's the ash and that the charcoal, there's a lot of talk, there's documentaries and all this stuff about charcoal now. Well, of course, that was a natural consequence of those gentle, regular burns. It's only when the debris of the forest can build up for 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, then you have a fire that comes through and it actually kills everything because there's so much debris on the floor, the forest floor, that it's too much, So it's interesting down in the south, like in Florida, they seem to have a pretty good handle on this. And in some of the parks, like the Everglades, which is an international park, like it's a very, very special place down there. They have continued the Indigenous traditions of burning the forest. And as you said, Indigenous people burn the forest right from, whatever, I as far south as I've ever gone. So the Ecuador, like the center, all the way to like the Pas in northern Manitoba. So I know for sure that those fires, and all through the prairies, it's why the prairies are the prairies, apparently, is because of Indigenous people burning for like 10,000 years, these regular fires that would regenerate the land, right? And of course, when you have a fire and that herbaceous layer is regenerated, then all those herbivores come in. And so much better hunting and it's a revitalization, it's a purification of the land, you know.
It's interesting. Someone in the crowd here just threw a comment in there, and I said, I feel like there are internal parallels with the fire. Chris talking about just sitting with lime and not suppressing how it moved through. I feel like I have a big fire in my internal world every little bit. And, you know, I can relate to that metaphor, you know, the need for even that internal fire once in a while to come through for cleansing. That's a really beautiful thought there. Sorry, I don't know how to say your name. It says WRY, but just acknowledging that's a beautiful comment and metaphor you're sharing there. So thank you. We're really rolling towards the last few minutes here, Stephen. I'd love to maybe hear a little bit about what's going on with Sacred Gardener. So you've got a couple of books going on. I mean, you're working on the land. What's up with you folks these days? What's kind of going on with Sacred Gardener, and what if people wanted to kind of connect with you more, or come learn, or what opportunities are out there for folks right now to connect with your work?
Thanks. We actually just started this Patreon thing. So thesacredgardener.ca. That's about as much as I could say because I'm so out of this world. My wife takes care of all these things. So anyways, this is kind of, we were thinking about it in any case, but it is in a sense a response to not being able to get out there and do public speaking. And we actually, you know, very sweet people, a few different people have kind of said, we'd really like to hear you talk, man, like just once a month or whatever you're willing to get on and talk. We want to hear you talk. So we're kind of working on that, and kind of huge learning curve in terms of the technology and the skill set and stuff. If you kind of imagine myself having gardened for basically 40 years and worked on the land, and having taught for 25 years or something like that, that stuff's all so natural and I don't want to say easy, but it goes easy. Whereas the technology thing, I'm still trying to kind of fit my way into, and not I'm nowhere near a sense of mastery, but just even competence would be good. So anyways, let's not put that down too much. Hopefully, I think it's interesting to people, and you kind of get a bit of an intimate taste of my gardens and how we make food and how we make other stuff, and maybe stuff that even in the school goes by too quick for people to grasp. And maybe this is an advantage of something like this, is you can roll it through a few times. I'm just finishing the editing and the photo work for The Roundhouse, which is a book on the cob stack wall earthship. So that's what it's called, because it's a south facing, backed into a hill, heavily glazed. So that's the earthship part in the earth. And then the stack wall is like stack wall logs, you know, like a log pile kind of thing, if you've seen the stack wall. And then the cob instead of cement, which usually stack walls are done with cement. And it's kind of like, it's a very ancient building, like really, really ancient. And everybody who sees it and goes into it feels that. It's a roundhouse. It's called The Roundhouse, the book. And I talk about my perceptions of our deeper spiritual and mystical connection with buildings that has been lost, you know. And so this is what I'm trying to do with gardening. This is what I try to do with medicine, with herbalism, and this is what I'm trying to do with building, is talk about, you know, and again, the word sacred has been overused, and I know that, but again, we have so few words for these things. So I am pulling on that word, even if I have a bit of a different take on it than maybe the old way. But just that the culture of all of these things, the ancient forms of gardening, pre-slavery, pre-Roman monoculture, they started all that stuff. We've gardened for 100,000 years or 50,000 years. Nobody even recognizes it because we used to just work with the earth, right? Just like Native people still do when they're given the chance, you know, in their traditions. And so all of these things that we consider skills, the actual word skill actually means something cut. It means a slice, a piece of something from something else. That's the origin of that word. So this is what we're trying to do in the school, is we're trying to give the culture back so that the skill is like the fruit hanging off the tree. And we're trying to take people back to the tree. So they're not just picking up the fruit and wandering off and still living their life the way they live it, but that they're actually coming into the tree of the thing and generating their own fruit, you know?
Wow. I'm just reflecting on that. That's such a beautiful analogy. I never knew that about the word skill. And this, so skill saw, right? I'm cutting a piece off with my skill saw. And it's interesting to think about, you know, learning when I came to live with you originally, Stephen, I think I was very much in this place of like skills and individual skill sets, you know? And I think what I picked up on that land there was an actual relational piece between all those skills, the tree there. So I'm just really connecting with that example. And it was, that's what was life-changing for me in the experience I spent time with you with. So I'm super grateful for that. And just before we split here, I guess I just wanted to do one more clarification. So the Patreon, I think it sounds like it's almost like a little bit of a journey throughout the year with you guys, right? Like where there's some stuff on cooking, what's going on in the garden, some live stuff. So it's kind of just following you through a year on the land, and there's a philosophical part to that, and there's a herbal part, and there's a cooking part, and there's a relational part, and it's just a kind of a glimpse of that. Is that kind of correct in saying that?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, beautiful. Awesome. I just noticed there's a couple people in there that sound like they're already in your community there. Sheena and someone else were saying there. So anyways, thank you so much. I don't know, do you have anything else you'd like to share before we kind of call her a close for the night there? Anything coming to?
No, I better not. I better not, or I take you all the way over.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. This was truly a pleasure. I actually feel re-energized and revitalized, even though I've been on the computer way too much this week. This felt healthy and healing and like good medicine to me. And thank you for taking your time. And to all of you, thank you for taking your time too. I know some of you may be in the same place.
Yes,
where you
thank you.
spent too much time on the computer. And I hope that this felt revitalizing for yourself as well. We're going to take next week off, so there'll be a little bit of a break. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with my wife, Laura, and really continuing to dive deep into exploring relationship with the plant worlds. So, so those of you that want to come back and join us in 2 weeks, we'd love to have you. Watch for a follow-up email. I'll send out a couple of links to some of the stuff we talked about. And yeah, blessings until we meet again, everybody. Take care.